If you've become a CEO and you're working 60 to 80-hour weeks, yet you're reaching the end of them unsure of what you actually move forward, then there's a good chance your problem isn't time management. It's that nobody ever clearly defined for you what the role now requires. That's the reason why you keep defaulting to what feels urgent, what looks important, or what you've always been good at. But learning how to be a CEO is not just about knowing what to focus on. You also need to evolve the way you think, lead, and how you operate. Because the version of you that built the business or that got you to this stage in your career isn't necessarily the version needed to lead it through to the next one. I'm Byron Morrison. I'm the author of The Effective CEO 2.0. And after working with first-time scale-up CEOs in 18 countries to become the leader their business needs, them not being clear on their role and priorities is one of the most consistent patterns I see. I give an example of this in my book where I was working with a founder CEO who'd taken a product to market. They'd raised several rounds of funding and now they were scaling. He found himself in a situation, though, where on top of driving growth, he also had to lead and manage a team, keep stakeholders happy, and oversee day-to-day operations, all while dealing with what felt like a constant stream of fires. At the time, he was working 60-plus hour weeks, and he still felt like he could never catch up. When he reached out to me for help, he said he wanted support in finding ways to become more productive. But when we really dived into it, what I found was that despite all of the hours he worked, he was only spending about 15 of them on high-value priorities. The rest was spent putting out fires, solving low-level problems, or working on tasks that shouldn't be done by a CEO. With so much on his plate, understandably, he thought he had a time management problem, when in reality, he had an effectiveness problem, as he wasn't effectively using the time that he had. That's why the lack of time was merely just a side effect of the actual issue, because underneath it all was a role clarity problem. Because at the start, he had to hustle, grind, and be involved in everything. Yet now that the team was in place, he wasn't really sure where he should be spending his days. This is a trap I see so many first-time CEOs stuck in. And the reason why that happens is because they've never properly defined their role. That's why they get pulled into whatever feels important or needs their attention. So, what does a CEO role actually require? Well, when you're scaling, there are four things that the business genuinely needs from you. And most first-time CEOs are barely spending any time in any of them. Not because they don't want to, but because nobody made this explicitly clear before they found themselves in the role. The first is setting and holding direction. Not just having a vision or strategy in your head, but making sure the priorities, decisions, and conversations in the business are staying aligned with where you're trying to get to. Because when this doesn't happen, the team finds themselves busy but scattered. And this is why often the CEO gets pulled back in to fill the gap. The second is building leadership, ownership, and accountability. Not managing people day to day, but developing the people around you so that they can make decisions on their own, they can own outcomes, and they can lead their areas of the business without needing you at the center of every significant decision. Because there's a meaningful difference between delegating a task and creating genuine ownership for it. Because when you only do the first, the work moves, but the weight stays with you. The third is deliberately allocating where your time, attention, and resources actually go. Because in a growing business, everything competes for the CEO's attention. Meaning if you don't have a deliberate system for where your focus is going, it's going to get absorbed by whatever is loudest or most urgent in the moment. And the fourth, and the one that really costs the most when it's neglected, is protecting the future from today's urgency. That means the thinking, the decisions only you can make, and the direction that only you can set. This is the work that often gets crowded out first, and it costs the most when it isn't protected. Now, when I ask most first-time CEOs to honestly look at where their time is going, the answer is usually the same. Most of it isn't in those four areas. In fact, on application calls for my Evolve CEO program, one question I always ask is if you look back on an average day or week, how much of your time was spent in tasks, meetings, or solving problems that you shouldn't be involved in? It's pretty common for CEOs to answer that 70, 80, or even upwards of 90% of their time is wasted in those areas. And that's a huge issue. Because when you're reacting, you're not leading. And that's the problem with not clearly defining your role and intentionally getting out of everything else. Because if you don't, you'll keep getting pulled back into the weeds and not moving forward the things that actually matter. That's why the next part of this is so important. And that is that just knowing this is not enough. Because some of you will be watching this right now and hearing parts of this for the first time because nobody has ever clearly explained what the role actually is. But for others, knowledge is not the issue. You've already know that you need to be more strategic, that you need to protect your time, delegate more, and step back from an operational level. And you've probably tried, yet despite that, you still find yourself getting pulled back in. It's not because you didn't try hard enough, it's because something else is happening underneath all of that that most content on this topic never actually addresses. Because what I found from working with CEOs in 18 countries is that even when someone understands what they should be doing, the version of them that built the business is often still running the show inside of a role that now requires something completely different. That's why one of the biggest things to take away from this video is that what got you here isn't going to be what takes you to the next level. The reason being is that the version of you who built the business by being in everything, by moving fast, and by solving problems yourself, that was needed at the start. That approach got things done, and it works until it doesn't. Because at scale, those same behaviors become the bottleneck. Because now when a problem comes up, you step in because you know how to solve it. Or when a decision stalls, you make it because it's quicker to do it yourself. Or when someone on the team is struggling, you help them because it feels like support. And none of that feels wrong in the moment. If anything, it feels like being a good leader. But what's actually happening is the old version of you is making decisions and taking actions that the role now needs you to handle differently. And here's the layer underneath this that most people don't talk about. When you stop being the one doing things, it can feel like you're no longer contributing at the level that you used to. That's because CEO work, like setting direction, thinking ahead, and developing people around you, rarely gives you that same immediate feedback as solving a problem or getting something done. This is why stepping back into the strategic work can feel unproductive or give you feelings of guilt that you should be doing something else. And this is why so many CEOs self-sabotage and throw themselves back into the chaos in order to feel safe and fill that space. And you step back because that's where it feels like you're adding the most value. One of the ideas I come back to throughout my book, The Effective CEO 2.0, is that your business's growth will never outgrow your inner growth. That's why if you're feeling stretched thin, reactive, and like no matter how hard you push, you're always behind, the constraint usually isn't outside of you. It's in the version of you that's still trying to lead a much bigger business using the wiring from a much smaller one. Or you're approaching the CEO role with the mindset or way of operating that worked in a different position. And until that shifts, no amount of scheduling systems or delegation frameworks will fully hold. So let's make this concrete. I had a client who'd been in the CEO role for around a year. When he stepped into the role, he had read every book he could find on being an effective CEO. He knew all the frameworks, he knew what he should be doing, yet still he found himself working in instead of on the business. He understood everything intellectually, yet still he was the person that everything rooted through. When we got into it, a few things became clear. His role had never been clearly defined for the current stage the business was at. This is why he kept defaulting to what felt important and urgent rather than what the job genuinely needed from him now. When we looked at where his time was actually going, the vast majority was reactive. All legitimate things to deal with, but none of them were work that only he could do. And because his time kept going there, the work that actually mattered kept getting displaced. But here's what I want you to understand about what actually changed. It wasn't getting clearer on the role, just reorganizing his calendar. What held was getting really honest about the patterns that was running underneath everything else. The pull to step in because he was good at solving things. The discomfort of sitting in the strategic work when the operational noise felt more immediately useful. The identity that was still telling him that being across everything was what good leadership looked like. Because once he addressed how he was showing up and operating internally, that's when the structural changes started to stick in a way that they hadn't before. Because yes, the role clarity matters, and so does the team development structure and accountability. But if the identity underneath it doesn't shift as well, everything else will keep getting quietly undone. So if you're a first-time CEO trying to figure out what this role actually requires, here's where I'd suggest starting. Not with more advice on what to do, but with an honest look at where the gap actually is in your specific situation. Because what the role requires at this stage, what's getting crowded out, and where you're still operating from an older version of yourself is gonna look different depending on the business you're running and where you're personally at in this transition. And you can't fix something that you can't clearly see. Because for one CEO, the main issue may be that the role has never been properly defined. For another, it may be that too much is still rooting through them because the team lacks ownership and accountability. For someone else, it may be that the structure might be there, but the way that they operate keeps quietly undoing it. That's exactly why I created the CEO Evolution Assessment. It's not about general advice about what CEOs should do. It's designed to help you identify where the gap is between how you're currently operating and what the business now needs from you. The assessment is free to take and it takes around 7 minutes. And if you're running a scaling company, I personally review every submission and I send back a personalized breakdown of the patterns I can see and what I would recommend focusing on first. Because the starting point is rarely more information. It's clarity on what the actual problem is. So the link to take the assessment is in the description below. So if there's one thing to take away from this video, it's that becoming a good CEO isn't just a knowledge problem. You can understand everything this role requires and still end every week wondering what you actually drove forward. Because knowing is only one part of it. The other part is becoming the version of yourself who can consistently operate at the level that the role now requires. That's the part that most content on this topic skips entirely. And in my experience, it's the part that makes the biggest difference between a CEO who's constantly reacting and the one who's actually leading the business to the next level. So take an honest look at where you are right now. Do you clearly understand what the role actually requires? Is that where your time and attention is really going? And has the way that you led evolved at the same pace as the business? Getting clear on those questions is going to be the first step towards becoming the leader your business needs. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and hit the subscribe button, as every week I put out new videos on how to become a better CEO. I've been Byron Morrison. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.